Okay, so with that, John Prof, maybe we should move on to our next speaker.
Yes, as he's getting ready on the side. So joining us next, please welcome Associate Professor Jeffrey Shumaker, who will share his insights from his experience as the Chief Urban Designer of New York, emphasizing design for a world-class city, learning from New York. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Antika, for the invitation, and the Institute for hosting. It's a great conversation. I've already met some wonderful people. I love Thailand. I think you have the friendliest people in the world. I don't know what you do, but keep doing it. And thanks, Don. I think you set me up well with a lot of the themes that you talk about, and I will share specifically what we did in New York City. I had the privilege of working for one of the great mayors, probably I would consider the greatest mayor, Michael Bloomberg, and one of the greatest cities in the world in New York at a time of incredible transformation. Oh wait, I have the clicker. Hold on. But before I get there, I wanted to share a little bit about myself. This is sort of my trajectory in life on one slide. I tell people I'm from New York, and they immediately think, you know, skyscrapers, midtown, skyline, lots of buildings. But I actually grew up in the upper left-hand corner in a part of New York that's about 6-7 hours away from the city in a very small town, and I actually grew up on a farm. But I was immersed in nature, and so a lot of the work that I did when I eventually made my way to the city was sort of bringing nature into the city. Which was severely lacking in pretty much every city, but particularly in New York at that time. Worked for, I think, just about every large three-letter firm in New York City that I could possibly work for, starting with Skidmore, SOM, to Kohn Pedersen Fox, to Bjarke Ingels Group, and on projects all over the world. You know, many projects in New York City, of course, but also new cities in Asia. And my focus was sort of very quickly came about the public realm, about really focusing on the public spaces between our buildings, because that's really what makes a city. And more recently, I'm doing more of this, you know, traveling to other cities, other places, and talking a lot about what we did in New York, and I love to teach. I teach at Columbia as well, so as much as I can share and help shape the next generation of designers, I enjoy doing that. But I'm going to focus really on my time working for the city of New York. I come from the private sector. I worked for a number of firms, as I shared, so I thought I was just going to do it for 2 years. You know, I gave it a couple of years. I was always curious about public sector, working in government. But I ended up staying for 10 years. And it was the highlight of my career. So my advice to you students is try it out. Try working for a government. Try working for an agency, because you might be surprised. You might actually enjoy it. And it's not something, I don't know how design training is here in Thailand so much, but certainly in the US, when I went through school, nobody told me that was an option. And there is a desperate need for creative thinking, design thinking in city government. So I joined at really, again, quite a unique time when Bloomberg was mayor. This lady here, Amanda Burden, was the commissioner and director of city planning, passionate about design, passionate about the public realm, studied under Holly White. You may have heard of William H. White, really looking at, and a lot of this I think resonates with what Don was just talking about, really trying to understand how people live in the city. And so she and the mayor wanted to create a separate design office within city government. And I say create, it's actually recreate, because it actually existed. Some of you may know Jonathan Barnett, who was the director of urban design under the Mayor Lindsay administration back in the 60s. So it was reestablishing that design office within a government agency. And all of us came with our architecture, city planning, landscape backgrounds, and used the tools that we have that you're all learning in school to help progress these projects. And it was also the year, it was 2007, when Bloomberg released Plan NYC, or Plan YC, which was really kind of the first comprehensive plan for the city of New York. Really looking at acknowledging that the city was going to grow by at least 1 million people over the next 10 or so years, but doing it in a way that could make the city greener, more livable, more sustainable. But again, Don, thank you. For us, it was really, in the urban design group, it was very much about, and a lot of what I'm going to say today seems pretty obvious, but I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves of the obvious, that cities are first and foremost about people. And yes, I'm more and more thinking about non-human inhabitants of the city, but it's really about people. And it's about seeing the city from their perspective. So, Don doesn't have to get on his knees to look at a model, but it's really presenting the city and presenting options from that pedestrian, that all-important pedestrian perspective. I'll share more. There was quite a lot of work that we did in Times Square to really transform that space to be more human-centered. And it's this relationship that, if you forget everything else, this is the most important design decision that you can make in a city. It's the relationship of the building to the sidewalk, to the street. And you'll hear me say this probably a few times in this talk, and I say this to my students all the time. The most important public space in any city is the street. And the street should be designed for everybody. It's not just for moving cars. It really should be mostly about this, about people walking in a city. That's what makes a city successful. And just, creating opportunities for people to come together without cars, and that's where public space is so important. And this is an image from the High Line that a friend of mine took that I really enjoyed, because it shows what can happen when, in this case, you're about 40 feet above the street level, and you can really just have fun. And it's also our truly public space. The street is our truly publicly owned space. So that's where, when we have protests or when we have opportunity to come together, it's the street where that happens. So again, why the street is really the most important public space. We also added, and I think one of the great legacies of the Bloomberg years is the addition of a number of parks around the city, mostly on the waterfront. New York's waterfront, like in Bangkok and like most cities, was traditionally where manufacturing and industry occurred. And over time, as that's moved out, it created lots of underutilized space on the waterfront that we could create parks and put more residential and other uses on. This is, for those of you who maybe haven't been to New York, this is in the Brooklyn side, and there's been an incredible transformation of the waterfront there. So it's, all together thinking about the public realm, and really, and often when we present to communities, not even using the term public realm, because it's a term that I think a lot of architects and planners understand, but not necessarily the public. And so we would go through and define what that is. Again, thinking about our streets not just for cars, but for, first and foremost, people, humans, for bikes, adding in bike lanes. It's about thinking about our public spaces and the transformation. By the way, I love to draw. I grew up as a kid of fine arts, and so I never thought that I would be using that skill as much as I did working in city government. But what we found is that the sketch was an incredibly powerful way to communicate to the public, particularly when you're talking about urban design, when you're talking about placemaking. Because I'm not the architect, I'm not the landscape architect. I don't want to get too specific about those elements, but I want to just present a picture of what could be in the future. also looking at our waterfronts. You know, I think, again, one of the great Bloomberg legacies is turning the city around to its water, to the waterfront edge, in a way that the city had kind of closed itself off previously. And then we have a lot of privately owned public spaces. You know, our 1961 zoning introduced the idea developers would get a huge floor area bonus for providing a public space on their property, but there was no design consideration. The regulations didn't require very much. It was just providing the space. So we kind of rewrote the rules twice under Amanda and Bloomberg to start to require, you know, what does a good, successful public space need? And then thinking about the space underneath our elevated infrastructure. In New York City, we have about 700 miles of this space that's often underutilized. And also quite controversial because, you know, in the Robert Moses era, who you may have heard about, was quite a notorious leader in the urban renewal days of New York City, often plowing infrastructure through the poorest neighborhoods. And so they became quite divisive. And so we saw this opportunity to look at space underneath as a way to reconnect, restitch communities back together. And even a lot of times when you know, certain neighborhoods, I wouldn't even use the word design, we would just talk about quality, you know, and substitute quality, because it's really what it is, right? It's about creating quality spaces for people to come together. And not just, you know, I think Bryant Park has seen an incredible transformation in recent years. Certainly the High Line, I mean, this picture is already completely outdated because of the amount of development that's happened around. I'll share more about the High Line specifically. But it's going beyond Manhattan, going beyond the city center and reaching out into all neighborhoods and thinking about how we can make them more walkable, you know, increase the quality of that experience. And I love to show this image, people that maybe have not been to New York City. This is also New York City. And many of these low-lying neighborhoods on our waterfront, on the harbor, were really at the front lines of climate change. When we had Hurricane Sandy, it was these neighborhoods that were affected the most. And so a lot of our time is thinking about this scale of development and how, through raising the architecture, through building in a certain level of resilience in the public spaces, to make the city stronger and adapt for changes in climate. This image, not long ago, would have been essentially illegal in New York. We prohibited sidewalk cafe seating in most of our streets. And so, again, something as simple as removing that barrier and allowing cafe seating to happen. I mean, this is in a neighborhood in Brooklyn where, you know, I love this sort of interaction of the interior and the exterior and the activity sort of spilling out into the street that you can only get if you can allow the inhabiting of that space of the sidewalk. And again, you know, sort of the streets, you know, really thinking seriously about our streets. All of Broadway in Manhattan, and certainly Times Square has been transformed. We brought in Jan Gehl, the sort of famous planner from Copenhagen. He did this sort of study of Broadway all the way from Central Park down to Lower Manhattan, and didn't find a single bench on the entire length of Broadway. There's nowhere for anybody to sit. And, you know, act quickly, think quickly, cheaply. You know, if you've heard of Project for Public Space, you know, this is kind of their thing, right? Is really, you know, this, by the way, this is in Madison Square Park, the Flatiron, the Flatiron building, you can just see on the left-hand side. This was all essentially a highway. Only cars were here. And so this was one of these, what we would call a temporary plaza, meaning that you don't even change the curb line. You just go in and sort of mark out space for pedestrians. You put in movable chairs, tables, potted plants. And they have an annual art installation competition. And this has become one of the most popular public spaces in the city. that was not possible not long ago. I mean, this was all, again, a highway, just lanes of traffic. And you know, there's often, at least in New York, we have this debate between public versus private. And in New York, it's really, they have to work together, you know, because we rely on our private developers to provide any number of benefits that we can't afford on our own. And so this example is in Domino Waterfront in the Brooklyn waterfront on the water. This is privately owned, privately maintained, but it's open to the public. And there are guidelines that are put in place and negotiated with the city as to how this space can be inhabited and used. But the fact that it's private sort of elevates the opportunity for design in some ways, and if anybody's interested, I'm not going to go into it now, because the Parks Department in New York is not really known for design or innovation, so if there's ways of getting around that, that when you partner with a private entity and the design that they can bring to it, sometimes it's actually better to go that route. And this I shared, this is a rendering of the same developer, it's just north of, and one day when the East River is clean enough to swim in, they're kind of setting the infrastructure and putting it in place for the eventual beach. I mean, this is a very idealized view of that, but you know, that's part of a designer's role, right? Is to provide a vision to get people excited about what could happen in the future, and the architecture in this case is big. Just a little video of what it looked like in our office. Again, our sort of little design office that we had within city government. Very familiar, I think, to many of you in this room, using trace and markers, and again, the tools to visualize to help work with planners, you know, and sort of come to solutions. So helping to visualize what we're hearing back from the community. The planners, you know, in New York City, every neighborhood has a designated planner assigned who goes to all the public meetings, who knows the neighborhood really well. We didn't have the capacity ourselves because we didn't have enough people, but we would work very closely with them to help them sort of work through whatever challenges they were facing. Sometimes models do help, you know. I mean, this is you know, we couldn't afford a digital printer at the city, so we did the old-fashioned model making by hand. But you know, it's important to look at things from all angles, but it's very important, though, to get on the ground as quickly as possible to really present that work that way. And policy, setting design policy. This isn't something I certainly did not learn in architecture school, but the power of policy versus a project. You know, that if you change, slightly tweak a rule, suddenly you're having an impact across an entire city. You know, so policy and regulations and zoning can be incredibly powerful. So I encourage all of you, again, more creative types to think about that as you work. And then, you know, advocacy, working with, you know, in New York, we have the benefit of many civic groups that we often, you know, look to support us as we, you know, as a way to kind of bring the public into the process. And as I mentioned, you know, a lot of the product of our work, it's a lot of sketching, but ultimately it's a lot of words in the end. You know, it's sort of creating a set of guidelines or changing the zoning. It's putting in text what we've been sort of sketching through. And then, you know, probably one of the last things I did working at the city was taking everything that we did in the Bloomberg and Burden days and putting it into writing and putting it on our website and making it very public. You know, when we say good urban design, what does that even mean? And so it's, you know, very simple set of principles, you know, that we developed, you know, over time, working across agency, across discipline, with a lot of different community groups. And kind of distilled it down to a set of 4 basic principles, and intentionally not using any jargon, no planning, no architecture jargon, putting it in basic language so that, everybody will understand what we're talking about. Starting with place, creating a sense of place. Every city has, I think probably every city claims to be a city of neighborhoods, and they really are. Every neighborhood has its own character. This example I'll give here is one of the great landmarks of Manhattan, Grand Central Station. As a work of architecture, quite phenomenal and almost demolished, but thankfully it wasn't, and it's a great landmark today, and it's a great gateway into the city. And we've seen a lot of this in Manhattan. This is you probably heard about the super tall phenomenon, where a lot of the sort of luxury residential, very, very thin buildings are sort of popping up all over Manhattan, which quite controversial in many ways, because in New York, a lot of this is what we call as of right, which means if you follow the zoning, follow the rules, you don't even have a meeting with the Department of City Planning. You don't have to meet with anybody. But that's sort of historically how the Midtown skyline, the Manhattan skyline, has developed. I personally think, keeping it changing, keeping it dynamic is actually good for the city. And there's a lot of historic buildings in this neighborhood that were preserved. We have a Landmarks Commission which protects kind of historically significant buildings. But we, again, sort of our focus is on the public spaces. And when you get on the ground in this neighborhood, they're lacking. These streets are not particularly walkable. There's really no reason to stay in this part of Midtown other than to go to work, or you kind of walk through it to get to some other place. And so we mapped it out. We landed on this sort of very short avenue right immediately next to Grand Central, and looked at, well, I think maybe here's an opportunity where we just remove cars from the street, and we can create a series of public spaces that can then put people, kind of at the heart of this neighborhood, right where Grand Central, one of these gateways into the city. And so again, a lot of drawing, a lot of sketching, quite low tech. But now I do all sketching on my iPad, and it's still sketching, but it's using technology. But it's again that process of sketching, not only as a process of working with the many stakeholder groups, many people that you're going to work with, but it's also internally. I think there's just something about that process of thinking that's really important. So don't, I always tell my students, don't immediately just resort to the computer or to the whatever software program you're using to do the design. You need to do the thinking first, and you need to have that process of engagement that I think sketching you just cannot replace. I think it's really an important step in the process. So we did a whole series of these. Again, not designing it, but just giving the potential, the kind of flavor of what that could be once you remove the cars from the equation. We worked with Gel on this, and we sort of packaged it up, and a lot of this work has been implemented. I don't think I have images of it today, but so we were focused on the street and the experience at the street, and then other departments within city planning were thinking about FAR, the floor area ratio, the height, density, and so this was One Vanderbilt, which was sort of the poster child as we were working through this plan for this neighborhood. But yes, it's a tall building. It's now it's quite prominent on the skyline, but I think our group is much more focused on the relationship of the building to the public space, also to Grand Central. And this is it today. So it's finished. The space has now become a really popular meeting point for people coming in and out of Grand Central. You actually have a place now that you can meet, which didn't exist before. Second principle is equity. You know, you're making sure that the city is open and accessible to everyone. And there's just a couple examples here that I'll share. We did a lot of work in a neighborhood which is a neighborhood that really hadn't seen any development and certainly any design work in a very long time in East New York, a neighborhood in Brooklyn. And so it was sort of thinking about, again, using sketches as a way to engage with local residents, a number of public housing communities in this area, you know, as a way to kind of bring them into the process and think about how we can introduce certain things and improve the street. And some things as basic as a crosswalk, you know, and we found that many of our streets don't actually have a real crosswalk, you know, so that people can get across the street easily. Thinking about lighting in these spaces where we have this sort of elevated structures, adding in some public art, you know, all these sort of basic things coming together to really make it a more inviting and walkable place. Detail is key. You know, even though we often, as urban designers, planners, we think we kind of zoom out, it's also important to zoom in. And again, you know, the example here is looking at a lot of these spaces under existing infrastructure and how through relatively small changes you can make that space more inviting, feel safer. This is a sketch of the High Line. This is a unique condition of the High Line that actually runs parallel and fronts onto 30th Street. And thinking about all of that space underneath that structure and how it can be, you know, used for galleries, used for cafes, park. You know, we have this sort of future park and how we can kind of engage with that structure. And then the last principle is comfort. You know, again, like pretty basic, but it should be about making people feel good, feel safe, and really want to be on a street or in a city. And we also worked with a number of city agencies led by our Department of Public Health and looking at the connection between public health and the physical environment. And so we did a whole study on just the importance of the sidewalk as a public space. And we took this sort of all-important perspective of somebody walking down the sidewalk and really pulled it apart to understand, you know, yes, this is probably the plane that most of us think about, the ground plane, you know, the surface that you walk on. But it's also the street side plane. You know, what do you see when you look across the street? What's edging you? Do you have parallel parking that maybe will make you feel a little bit safer as a pedestrian walking down that street? Do you have street trees? You know, do you have, you know, what's with the sky plane? You know, do you have shade? Is there a canopy? And I would argue for a great sidewalk, the most important surface to think about is the building face. It's not even what you're walking on, but it's the ground floors of buildings. And in New York, it turns out that city planning has a lot to say about that through zoning by requiring what sort of uses go in the ground floor that can help to activate and create a more interesting edge, looking at transparency. You know, what sort of window, percentage of transparency can you actually engage and look into that building? So there's lots of things that we can do in that plane so that when they all come together, it really creates a great sidewalk. And New York still has a long way to go. I certainly, just in my limited time in Bangkok, I think there's a lot of work to do in this space. We were just in Chiang Mai for a few days there too. You know, I think there's a big accessibility challenge. You know, how do we make it so that somebody in a wheelchair can get around the city? So, you know, again, but the important thing is to get on the ground, you know, and really think about it from that perspective. And then we had some protocol, some steps, you know, what do you do? I think hopefully this should be pretty obvious to many of the students in the room, but first and foremost, you should actually visit a place before you are proposing any change. There's only so much you can get from a Google Street View. And a lot of my students cheat. I said, did you actually go there? You see the little Google symbol there, right? It's like, no, you didn't, that's not your photo. Go, walk it, sketch it, smell it, hear it, because there's a lot of the senses that you're not getting from a Google Street View. Survey, I don't advise putting your hand in a gutter like I did for some strange reason in this picture, but trying to get a sense of some of the barriers. Measuring, there's a lot of tools now that make this a lot easier and a lot faster, but sometimes the old-fashioned tools can work best. Engaging, and again, so at public meetings, we would often roll out the trace, take photos of the neighborhood, blow them up, poster size, put them on the wall, and as we're hearing back from the community, we would start sketching and sort of showing, okay, is this what you're talking about? It's a kind of real-time way of engaging with the public. I love the Minecraft example that was given earlier. I think any way we can use creative tools and particularly bring kids into the process is great. I think some of this is pretty obvious to this audience, but mapping, and there's many ways you can map a place and really understand current and future conditions. But the important thing is to use these tools as a way to create this give and take. It's a communication process that's really critical. And then, scale, I think you mentioned this as well, is sort of thinking across scale. If you're going to look from the air, you also have to look from the street and really understand, what that experience is. There's a sort of funny photo that New York Times took of, this plan is where we were looking at mixing, in some ways kind of going before zoning, because zoning sort of pulled apart residential goes over here, office goes over here, sort of separated uses. And in many ways, we're kind of going back to the pre-zoning days in New York, and how do you mix these activities in the same structure, in the same neighborhood? Because what we found in New York is that people actually want to live in neighborhoods where coffee is being roasted or things are being made, and there's ways that you can regulate the pollution levels, but still maintain those uses together. And anticipate, really thinking long-term. The example I give here is work that we did partnering with our Office of Emergency Management, thinking about sort of the what-if scenario. So this was before Hurricane Sandy hit New York, 2 years before. Really thinking about and we were developing a module of temporary housing, sort of a stackable unit, because this was when Katrina, you may remember Katrina in New Orleans, a major hurricane that did a lot of damage, lost a lot of lives, and their temporary solution was putting trailers in a parking lot, surface parking lot. Well, we knew in New York, we don't have that kind of space. We don't have the luxury of parking that we could fill, so we had to develop a more stackable temporary housing module to house people quickly. And then thinking long-term, thinking about what should that waterfront look like? How do we let water actually come in a way that we've been so kind of afraid of and sort of opposed to in the past? It's actually these edges that actually work best, allowing nature to do its thing and helping us to create a more resilient city. And even thinking about maybe floating some housing, and there's all sorts of ways to kind of reimagine the waterfront. And then the last one is question the status quo. Again, this is where I look to you creatives to do that, because particularly when you work for a city agency or any kind of bureaucracy, oftentimes it's just keep doing the same thing. It's easier to just keep doing the same thing. The same way we've been doing it for years, we'll just keep doing it. But I think it's, the training that you get in architecture and other design professions, it allows you to think differently. It allows you to kind of question immediately, like what we should do. And the example here, again, to come back to the street and the kind of transformation that started under Bloomberg and thankfully is continuing today with current administration. And how just putting a chair out into, and I remember people saying at City Hall in the early days, like, who would want to sit in a street, in a asphalt area, and it happened immediately. Immediately we put these chairs as a sort of, almost as a statement of saying, this space is for people. In one of the most crowded parts of the city, and I think Gail looked at, you know, it's like 90% of that space was for cars, even though 90% of the user is somebody on foot, not somebody in a car. So the balance was off. And then hiring in an artist to come in and paint the street, through asphalt art. Again, nothing has changed. Everything here is temporary. So the idea is we can test it out, because these things are controversial, right? People get really scared, and particularly taxi drivers and others, like, no, you can't take away my street. So the idea, okay, if it doesn't work, we'll take it away. But we knew, and the head of transportation knew, that once you create the space, it's not going away, because it became really popular, and now we have the Times Square that we have today. One of the most popular, and by the way, it was the business owners that were opposed to this in the beginning, and their sales have skyrocketed since this has happened. This is now some of the primest of real estate in the city is around Times Square. And so this is now, now we have communities coming to the city asking for this, saying, well, we want what you did in Times Square, we want it in our neighborhood. How do we start creating these again, temporary spaces? And then, thinking about bikes, we had hundreds of miles of separated bike lanes throughout the city. And that as well, thankfully, is continuing today. Because I think once the momentum is there, once you make that initial change and that initial investment, it takes on a life of its own. So now, I don't know where I am with time. I don't know if somebody can give me like a time check. Am I good? Okay. So I have just two kind of case study, sort of more specific examples. One being Coney Island. This is really the first thing I worked on when I joined the city. And for those of you who don't know, Coney Island is at the very tip of Brooklyn. Manhattan is up there where it says New York. People often think New York is only Manhattan. Well, no, it's actually 5 boroughs. It's a much larger area. But it was, before people started flying, it was really the place people in New York, in Manhattan at the time, would go for entertainment, for amusements. Some of you may know Rem Koolhaas's work, Delirious New York. In there, he talks about, it was actually in Coney Island where a lot of the architectural innovation and exploration happened before it reached Manhattan. Because of the sort of craziness that was Coney Island. It was meant as a place to escape the real life of the city. And just a subway ride away. It was like a 45-minute to an hour subway ride, and you were in another place. And so the architecture was very playful, often looking to Europe, lighting, thinking about what it looks like at night. So this is all happening in Coney Island, really before it started happening in Manhattan. Thinking about the skyline. I'm sorry, went a little fast there, but I love this image. This is from about 1910. How everyone's wearing a hat and everyone's dressed up, but it was really one of the primary destinations for people at the time to get away from the city. It had changed considerably over time. Robert Moses, the same guy who I was mentioning before, hated Coney Island because it was a place of fun, amusement. Things kind of got out of control. He didn't like that. He liked to control things. And so a lot of it was demolished. And it was a place where he placed a lot of public housing as a way to kind of, in many ways, kill Coney Island as an amusement destination. But we do have a few of the amusements that remain. And so now, today, they're landmarked, they're protected, they're not going anywhere. And so we, through a process of working with, over years, many-year process of working with the community, the many communities, including the public housing residents and business owners in Coney Island, and then using, again, the tools that we have as designers to sketch through and think about how can we create these connections that can kind of bring back the glory of this place. And so we created an illustrative plan, The amusement area is kind of on the right here, but there's a lot of residential. A lot of people live there, and so thinking about this neighborhood from the resident standpoint as well. Coming back to this image, really dissecting it and understanding as we're developing this for the future, how do we make sure that our rules don't prohibit the kind of elements that we actually like in the historic image, So really looking at these little umbrellas, the transparency of the architecture, the dimension, it's essentially a 40-foot square, that sort of intimacy of that street. And this is really one of the only pedestrian streets in New York City, which is interesting. And so we wanted to make sure that any future growth would maintain that. This is an image of what it looked like at that time. We had a pretty aggressive developer who was not happy with what we were doing in the city, so he started demolishing quite a lot of what was there. And so every time you see a blue fence, it was his property that he demolished. So we had to kind of move quickly through the process as well. And again, using sketching as a way, these were all meant for internal discussions within city planning, but also across city agencies. But we ended up using these sketches for the public review because, again, we found the sketch was a better way to engage with people. And just to kind of capture the spirit of what could be in the future. Another view, this was once a lively place of rides and amusement, but now is used to store cars, and how we could think differently about, what that space could be. There's a history of elephants in Coney Island. So I was having a little fun. I'm like, what if the NYPD, the police department, had to get around on an elephant? It could be. We created a new street connecting to the Wonder Wheel, which is existing. And again, sort of just, the sky is the limit, which is what this sketch was trying to convey, that if you include amusements in your project, the sky was literally the limit. You could go as tall as you wanted. And a certain portion of it would be open amusement area. Unlike Disney World, where you have to pay to play, Coney Island, the success for a lot of middle class and other residents is that it's affordable. You can just go and ride one ride, and so it's not expensive. This is what it looks like today. So we kind of brought back a lot of this amusement. It's incredibly popular, incredibly well used. Lots of fun. You're right on the beach. It's a very popular destination in the summertime. And we give a lot of thought to, as we do with streets, thinking about the boardwalk and how the future architecture should engage with the boardwalk to sort of maintain that active edge going along. And then lastly, finally, the High Line. I'm sure you've heard about the High Line, but I'm going to share a little bit more about the planning that we put in place that allowed the preservation of that structure and the High Line to happen, and the development around it. History, Robert Moses, again, I keep mentioning this guy's name, quite a powerful man in the history of New York. He actually was in charge, and this structure was built as a way to minimize traffic, because the trains used to run on the street. And there were a lot of people killed by these trains, and so they wanted to kind of separate the trains from other users. Closed in 1980, mostly truck traffic now coming into the city. And it was really these two guys, Josh and Rob, who met at a community board meeting. And they had been to Paris, and Paris, the Promenade Plantée, which is very similar, elevated park, former train line. And they thought, why can't we have that here in New York? Why can't we do something similar? We're very active. This is where it's sort of located within the island of Manhattan. If you haven't been there, and then pretty simple diagrams to convey to the public how this is going to work, because the challenge is that the High Line sits on private property, and those property owners were really limited in what kind of development they could do on their property. So they wanted the whole structure torn down. And it was the previous mayor, Giuliani, who agreed, but he thankfully was at the very end of his term, right before Bloomberg came in as the new mayor. And Bloomberg worked with these groups saying, we actually like this idea. Let's figure out a way to keep this structure and allow development to happen, allow property owners to realize the full potential of their investment. So we created a transfer of development. I don't know if that's a thing here in Bangkok, transfer of development rights, so which says you can't build where your property sits, but you can sell your property rights to another site where you can build. And so that's what happened, is that we created this sort of, the yellow sort of indicates the property value of the air rights for that property owner. But they can't build it there, but they can sell it and transfer it to our receiving sites that would allow that greater density. And so this was the existing conditions at the time, 2013 projected build out. It's essentially built today. All of this development that you see around the High Line was a result of this unlocking that development potential where the High Line structure itself existed. You've seen these pictures. Original estimates the city had were about 400,000 visitors per year. I think it's now about 12 million visitors a year come to the High Line. So it's been incredibly successful, and there's all sorts of different conditions. Unlike the Promenade Plantée in Paris, we wanted the High Line to have a series of different experiences as you're going along the structure, worked with field operations and Dwani Zyberg, mostly field operations to sort of figure out these different conditions. And, it's been, again, much more successful than the city thought it would be, and essentially generating income for the city. The city paid for the capital costs. They paid to build the High Line, but then it's up to the Friends of the High Line, the sort of nonprofit community group, to pay for the maintenance. And so the city got a good deal because they know the maintenance is actually the bigger cost. And the result has been all of this development, which the property taxes from this new development goes back into the city coffers, so it's actually turned out to be a really good investment for the city. It's created a fully public space. Still not complete. We still have the whole section around Hudson Yards, which needs to maybe too successful. This is often what it looks like on a nice day. It gets very crowded. I think in retrospect, maybe the pathway should have been a little bit wider. The landscape architects really wanted to maximize the planting area, so we sort of kept the space quite narrow. My favorite time to go is in the evening. It's less crowded, but the lighting is all downlit, so the plants are lit, but you don't have the lights in your face. It's sort of, you can really kind of see the city in a nice way. And again, it's created Shigeru Ban's lovely the Shutter House. The architects all over the world, the sort of famous architects were hired to sort of build in this space. And we like to take a little credit from the city side, the fact that we elevated design in the public space, in the High Line, that sort of pushed developers to think and challenge and hire better architects to do the architecture along it so that they can kind of work together. Zaha's project on the High Line. There are two civic anchors. This is a museum that Renzo Piano designed on the very southern end of the High Line. And in the northern end, this is an older photo. This is now complete, but this is the Shed, which is an expandable performing arts mixed-use facility, which was kind of the northern civic anchor to kind of connect the two ends of the High Line. And then Hudson Yards, which is quite a large development behind it. It is being extended. SOM just completed an extension connecting it to Moynihan Station using cross-laminated timber. There's a thriving arts community, arts program on the space. This is coming. I don't think it's there yet, but they're the city's largest pigeon sculpture is going to be. But it creates this really interesting platform for arts to be experienced. And that's it. I think that's my last slide. So thank you again. Thank you again.